Hi, my name is Jeremy Kraybill, and this is the time-lapse video of my Robot Art 2018 painting submission. I'm going to be narrating it just to tell you a little bit about what was going on. Here I'm doing my setup. So I am using 5 pots of paint. I've got burnt umber, yellow, magenta, cyan, and then I pre-mix a light cream that was primarily white with a little bit of yellow and burnt umber. And that was what was used for the robot for the first part of painting, and as it went along, it was darkening up that cream into sort of a mid-brown. I've also added a fair amount of water to those pots. I'm using gouache paint, which is a very fast-drying water-based paint. It does require water, and it dries out very quickly. I just did a test run with a sheet of paper to make sure that the brush strokes were the right width. Everything looked good, so I didn't make any adjustments to this stage. I moved right into painting. And immediately the robot starts by painting with the cream, and you may notice it dipping over to darken that cream up with primarily yellow and burnt umber, a little bit of cyan and magenta as it moved along. And at that stage I just stopped to make sure that the color mix looked okay. The previous run I had used way too much cyan and came out with sort of a greenish, a light green color for these early hues, which didn't look right. I was happy with that, so I didn't make any adjustments there. So the robot is continuing to paint, it's mixing in, and that cream is now becoming sort of a light brown, almost skin tone, and it's mixing in various colors. The color mixing I had really been changing right at the last minute, hadn't had a chance to test any of it for this final run. I've now moved into the second stage, which I moved in much earlier than the night before, and you'll notice that the robot has moved to painting out of the palette at the bottom. It's using primarily the cream mixed in with burnt umber. And I stopped it here because I panicked. I realized that the robot's paint mix, which I had written just right at the last minute for this last run, although it was using the minimum amount of burnt umber I could put into the mix, it was coming out way too brown. What you see, the brown there, is supposed to be sort of a light mid-brown, and it was quite dark. It was using 5 strokes of cream and 1 stroke of burnt umber, and I just realized that this was the wrong approach. I was using 6-stroke mixing, so 5 strokes green, 1 stroke of burnt umber, and so here I stopped and I rewrote that code to use a 24-stroke mix spread over 80 strokes on the page. So it would start with 6 strokes of cream, paint that, then it would add in like 1 stroke maybe of burnt umber and the rest of cream, and then maybe magenta or cyan, and keep going. The idea was that over time it would get to sort of a consistent color. That didn't happen in practice. On the page it ended up really coming out with quite a variety of colors. I liked the end product, but it wasn't really an intended consequence. I had watched a YouTube video that was advocating doing more color mixing with gouache on the page than you do in the palette, and that was partially my concept, but it really didn't work as I intended. I'm happy with the result though. Here I stopped to rehydrate the gouache, which was starting to coagulate quite a bit, and the color mix has now been adjusted. So you'll notice that pot at the bottom much lighter than the brown it had been earlier. It's using mostly the brownish cream, and then it is adding burnt umber from time to time. Instead of sort of ending up with a consistent status quo color in that pot over time, it ended up kind of cycling through different colors. So you notice here it's a little bit more cyan, then it's going to go more brown, then it's going to go more cream. That resulted in a wide variety of colors. Like I said, I liked the result, but it wasn't exactly what I was going for. I've now moved over to mixing out of the second paint palette pot at the bottom. So we're moving into kind of the midder, darker browns, painting the background a little bit, filling in details. And at this point, I'm fairly happy with how the colors are looking on the page. But one of the issues with gouache is that what you see when it comes off the brush really changes by the time it dries. And so there really wasn't much time to make adjustments that would account for that. I stop here. I'm adjusting the color mix again. I think at this point I was using just a little bit too much magenta in the brownish reds, and so I adjusted that down and adjusted it to using that 24 color mix I had been using, and then kept going. So we're still in sort of the mid browns. At this point we're about halfway through the paint, so it was a total of 4,000 strokes that were used on this particular run. We're probably just under halfway here. I'm stopping there to hydrate a couple of the colors that had really started building almost a skin on top, and then we keep going. Robot's moving pretty quickly at this point, and I'm fairly happy with the result, but what I'm really hoping to avoid was the disaster I had on the night before, which was that I had a one-line bug in my code that caused a long brown stroke to be painted across the page, and I was fairly sure I'd fixed that, but at this point that would have been really game over if that had happened. The robot is now continuing to paint the browns. It's now moved to the third pot, which was for reddish browns. Again, here when it came into mixing, I noticed the color mix was a little bit off of what I was going for, so I made some code adjustments and I kept going. And same thing here. I think this was probably the second tint out of that pot, changing the color mix a little bit and just making sure that it was going to get me the result that I was looking for. And a little bit more code adjustment. I think I probably spent about 30 minutes in code during this final run. So it's probably about 2.5 hours of painting and 30 minutes of bug fixing. We're on that third pot and we're now starting to fill in the eyes and some of the facial detail. The background is coming in and it's starting to come together. I'm starting to get worried about time here. I only had about maybe an hour left in the lab here before I got kicked out, and I wanted to make sure I finished. So at this point I pretty much committed myself to not making any adjustments that weren't absolutely necessary. We're now moving into the darkest browns and filling in that hair as well as some shadows around the collar. This was sort of a magenta brownish color, and now we're moving into the magenta orange colors on the right, and then we move back to some of the brown tints and are using those, filling in the remaining detail. And then the only color pot that's left is going to be the final one on the right, which is very brief. It's just a little bit of green for some highlights, and the painting is nearing completion now. I'm on the home run and I finished with less than 30 minutes left in my lab time. I was pretty happy with the result, and I was pretty happy with the final painting as it turned out and as I was able to submit it to the Robot Art 2018 competition. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I really appreciate your time. And if you like my painting, please do vote for it in the Robot Art competition. Thanks for your time.